We've been thinking in recent evening messages about reading the Bible well. And I thought it was good to do one more message tonight, more in a teaching format, again, about reading our Bibles well. It's such an important subject because the Bible is the Word of God. And if it is how we can know about Jesus, about how we can know the good news of how we can be right with God, and about salvation and so on, and through faith in Him. It is where God tells us how we can live for Him, how we can please Him. And it's also where we can find confidence for the future. And much, much more. But as we have seen then in recent evening messages, if you were here with us, we thought a lot about how some parts can be very difficult. And it's such a thick book, written in a long span of time, in a different culture. And not every part is easy to understand. Yes, the main message is easy, and the main idea of what we can draw about God and Jesus and so on, that is clear. But other parts can sometimes be confusing, can't they? Or even if we don't read them carefully using sound principles, we can interpret them wrongly and get off on the wrong track. And so last time we went into a bit more detail on two genres, two types of books. The first one was the story part of the Bible, what we call narrative. And the other part was then what we call apocalyptic writing, those stories full of symbols and pictures that generally look into the future. And those are the two types of writing we find in the book of Daniel. In the mornings we've been going through the book of Daniel, and so far we've seen all the stories, all these events, the things that Daniel experienced and his friends and so on. And in the coming months, in the evenings, we hope to go into the second part of the book and open up those visions and dreams and see what they have to teach us about the future and about how we can serve God. But tonight, I want to look at a third genre, another one that is very, very common in the Bible. Much of our Bibles are written in this style. And boys and girls, if you open your Bible, if you've still got it open, you can see it perhaps, how it looks different, right, on the page, and how there's much more white space all around and shorter lines, and they are all formatted even in a different way. Because these are poems, these are songs, and we can call them poetry or poetic writings. And we've read a psalm just now. Some of you joined in that, and these lines, generally, it works different, right? If you read a song, it works very different from reading a story, where other parts of the Bible where you read through a story, and it's a different way of using our language. Now, about a third of the Bible is written in these more poetic style, in a poetry style. Think of the Psalms and the Proverbs, most of the book of Job, the Song of Songs, great parts of the prophets. And some of these are entirely poetry. And many other books contain small bits of poetry even, a song here or there, or a poem. And so I think it's really important that we get some handles on just how we read this part of the Bible and do that well. And then at the end of the message, I want to sort of draw that to a conclusion by looking at Psalm 2, the one we just read, the psalm that fits so well with the book of Daniel. The themes that show us that God is the king over every king, and that the rulers and the kings of the earth mustn't rebel against him, and we all mustn't rebel against him, but we must worship him, and that is a good thing. The psalm ended, blessed, happy, to be congratulated are all those who take refuge in God. So again, as in previous times, of course, in a message like this, I will have to be quite brief on this. If I mention things that are still not very clear, or you want to hear a bit more about, please do ask, and I can help you with that. And yeah, if I'm short or quite brief on these things, it always risks being a bit too simplistic perhaps. So again, these are general principles. I'm sure you can find an exception here or there, but it's a good starting point, I believe, for some further study, even in that third of the Bible. So the first main block now in the message is about how to read poetry well. How to read poetry well. And first we can ask, what is poetry and why is it even used? Why is such a big part of the Bible written this way? Someone put it like this. Most of the Hebrew prophets wrote these beautiful poems. Actually, the majority of how God speaks to people in the Bible is through poetry. And it's also very common in the story parts of the Bible, the narrative, that the story stops, it's sort of you hit pause, and then the main character bursts out in some song or praise to God. Maybe you remember the story of the Exodus, where the people of Israel go out of Egypt and they get to the Red Sea, and the Red Sea then gets a path, right? And they walk through the dry path across the sea. And there the story stops, and the next chapter sort of tells the story again, but then in the form of a song. Why is that? Why first a story and then a song, a poem? Wouldn't one version be enough? Well, actually, these poems, these songs have a different purpose than the stories. Someone said the poem sort of ignites our imagination and our emotions, and it does so through the experience of verbal art. I thought that was a really helpful way to think of poetry. Verbal art, like art with words. So think about it. How do we use language? How do you speak to one another? If you tell each other what you've done in a day, I think often we use ordinary language. Just simple sentences, not too many details. We are using general words, normal words. And you can see that most of the stories in the Bible are written in that way. But next to ordinary language, normal language, you've got this poetic language, or in a different way you've got the more analytical or the scientific language. An example. Last week, compare, if I say, I desire to be close to God. That's normal language. But last week we looked at the psalm in the evening, and there the psalm says, in basically the same thing but then in poetry. And it said this: You, God, are my God, earnestly I seek you. I thirst for you. My whole being longs for you in a dry and parched land where there is no water. You see, it basically says, God, I want to be closer to you. But it does so in other ways, with picture language, and it compares it to other things in life. There's more detail, but not sort of precise detail. It doesn't speak about the doctrine of knowing God, or the doctrine of God being everywhere, so whether or not you can actually be closer and so on. No, it does in a way that brings our emotions into it, and it compares it with a picture of being thirsty in a dry land. That's sort of the difference. Normal language, poetic language, scientific language. And poetic language therefore uses these images and what we call a metaphor. So kids, I'm going to use quite a number of big words here. If you know any of them, if you don't know them by the end, come to me and I'll try again. But I hope to explain all the big words I use and make it simple, okay? So metaphor is basically a word picture. It's maybe you've heard figurative speech, not literal, but figurative, a picture using it with words. And that is what poetry is full of, metaphors, these pictures. And they describe something not just to give us information, but to help us experience it, to feel it. It doesn't just say that the weather is beautiful, it uses pictures to make us feel, oh yeah, I like this is good, this is beautiful. To celebrate something, or to mourn about it, or to enjoy it, or to help us think or feel differently about something. And that works actually, even if we have not experienced it ourselves. Poetry can use these comparisons and word pictures of things we do know. And therefore it helps us to imagine even, think about heaven. We've never been in heaven, but the Bible is full of descriptions and it compares it. It's a bit like that, and it doesn't have that. And it will be very beautiful and very good. And in that way, by comparing it to things we do know, we can imagine something we have never seen before. C.S. Lewis said, poetic language helps us to have the quality of experiences we have never had. And I thought that was really, really powerful way of putting it. The quality of experiences which we have not had. And we can feel or get excited about it anyway. Now then, when we look at these poetic sections of the Bible and the poetry, how can we read this well? I want to just use basically two big helps for us. The first one is to think a bit more about metaphor and that figurative speech or picture language. And then secondly, think about the structure and the style. So first, a bit more about metaphor. And again, that's a big word, but we do this every day. We do this all the time. For example, you use the words warm and cold not just to tell you about the temperature of the day, but also to describe how close you are with someone. If you say, well, we are very warm, or she is a bit cold to me, you're not meaning something that you can measure with a temperature, of course, but you mean how close you are and whether your relationship is good. And that's a very normal way of speaking, and we do that every day. And so did the people in the Bible, and those who wrote the Bible. So everyday language just works that way. But for us, when we read the Bible, the difficulty can be that their everyday language was a bit different. They lived in a very different time, 2,000 years ago perhaps, or in a completely different culture. So not every picture language in the Bible, not every metaphor is as easy to understand for us as others. And so these metaphors in the Bible, they are drawing on the stories in the Bible, and so we can compare. We can use the narrative to help us better understand the poetry. And in that way, we can also use the poetry again to see more the richness of the story. So we can use both parts of the Bible to help us grow in understanding the other. For example, if you glance just one psalm back to Psalm 1, if you think of verse 3 there, describing a person who lives well with God, it says, that person is like a tree planted by streams of water, which yields its fruit in season, whose leaf does not wither, whatever they do prospers. All metaphors, pictures of comparing a person with a tree, but a tree that has beautiful fruit, beautiful leaves. How can we see the richness of this picture? Well, think again of the start of the Bible, in paradise, with all the beautiful trees, and the tree of life bearing fruit again and again and again. And basically, it's bringing these sort of paradise pictures into this song as a description of what it means to have a life with God. So the story helps us to see the riches of the picture and to understand it well. And in that way, they interact, as it were. Another example would be the way the Bible speaks of the waters and the sea. It's generally a picture of chaos and danger for the people. So compare it again to the very start of the Bible again. When God created the heavens and the earth, there was just water and chaos and darkness. And by the end, in the end of the Bible, it says there won't be any sea in heaven. And you think, wow, that would be a pity, but it means there won't be any chaos and danger. It doesn't necessarily mean there won't literally be any big bodies of water there. The stories help us to understand the language. The language of the poetry helps us to understand the stories better. Now, when we do so think about, okay, there's all these figures of speech, all these metaphors in poetry. How do we then understand the picture, understand the poem better? Let's get back to Psalm 2. So the first good way to try and read our Bibles better is just look at the picture. Don't try and jump across the picture and see what it's sort of getting at. But first see, okay, what does this picture, what kind of emotions do I get? For example, in verse 3 of the song, Psalm 2, verse 3. Let us break their chains and throw off their shackles, this is what these kings say. Of course, these aren't literally bound, they don't have handcuffs on, and they aren't saying, well, we get our angle grinder out and we're going to cut the handcuffs, as if they're literally bound and chained by God. But of course, we understand that perhaps, but don't just jump beyond it. What does that picture evoke? What can you imagine if someone says, oh, I'm bound in chains and I'm in shackles and I want to break those off? There's all sorts of things about, I want the freedom, right? I want to have that liberty. I don't want to be bound by someone else. So if we think a bit more about the picture itself, we see, okay, what are these kings actually saying is, I don't want to be constrained by God. I don't want to be sort of imprisoned by God. I don't want to see God as somebody keeping me in check. I want that freedom. And it's therefore a very powerful picture of the kind of rebellion they want. And slowing down there for a bit and first seeing what the picture is about helps us to understand the poem as a whole better. It's the same, for example, with verse 9, where it speaks of the future king. You will break them with the rod of iron, God says. You will dash them to pieces like pottery. Again, you can't throw a person to pieces like pottery. But what happens? It's a picture of complete destruction. There won't be any use for the pot anymore. There won't be a good benefit. It will be destroyed. So think a bit more. Okay, what kind of emotions do I get because of that? What do I see in the picture itself? And then we make the step. What is actually being told us in the spiritual way? These kings, they won't have a good ending. Their whole thing, everything they've built, it will be broken to bits. It will be destroyed. The second lesson for us is when we think, okay, these poetry is full of metaphors, it prevents us from taking things too sort of literally, in a blunt, literal way, while they are meant figuratively. And if you don't do that, this leads to all sorts of issues. For example, you maybe know how in the past they had the discussion of, does the Earth rotate around the Sun, or does the Sun rotate around the Earth? Is the Earth fixed, or is the Sun fixed? And some people were reading the Psalms and they say, well, the Earth can't be moved. God set it on its foundations. So it must be that the Earth is fixed in the middle. But that's not really the point of the song, is it? And so if you bluntly force it too literally, you can get into all sorts of trouble. Okay, that's everything about metaphor. Second area, the structure and style of poetry. If we understand a bit more how that works in the Bible, it will help us to read these bits well. Think about what are ways in which English poems show us it is a poem. Any ideas, kids? If you make a poem or a song, what do you use to show it's a song? Yeah, Tracy?
Use different lines.
Yeah, different lines. Yeah.
We put verse 1, verse 2 in the chorus, and the bridge if you want to.
Yeah, you use the structure of the song, right? And you met with repeated things with a chorus. Yeah. Rhyme. Yeah, very good one. That's what I had written down as well. Yeah. So we use the structure of the song, rhyme, and sometimes the rhythm or the pattern, even in a line, the meter it's called for the musicians amongst us. The type of rhythm in a line and how that repeats. Well, it doesn't work that way in Hebrew. Hebrew poetry works differently. It doesn't use rhyme, doesn't use rhythm in the same way. There are other bits though, other ways in which we can recognize Hebrew poetry. And it's good to know about them and to recognize them, because that helps us to understand these songs better. First one, a bit similar, is a refrain. You can have a repeated line emphasizing something, but also you've got sort of a sandwich where the beginning and the end, for example, is the same. You can see this in Psalms 1 and 2. Look at Psalm 1 verse 1. Blessed is the one. And how does Psalm 2 end? Blessed are all who take refuge in him. So Psalms 1 and 2 are sort of put together by the bits of sandwich at the back. We call that in the difficult word as an inclusio or a chiasm. That's the one I mentioned last time. It shows a structure where the outsides are the same to show this bit belongs together. This is something that tells you as it were one story. And the most important one is parallelism. Parallelism, yeah. It's basically saying two lines next to each other and they belong together, and the way they belong together tells us something. As an example, Psalm 2 verse 1. Psalm 2 verse 1 says, "Why do the nations conspire and the peoples plot in vain?" Think about it. Well, that's basically saying the same thing twice. The nations, they rise up and the peoples plot in vain. The only maybe difference is that in vain, but otherwise it's more or less the same. And in verse 2 it's the same thing again. The kings of the earth rise up, the rulers band together against the Lord and against his anointed. It's basically saying the same thing. So someone said, instead of rhyming sounds, the lines in Hebrew have rhyming thoughts. So not rhyming sounds, but rhyming thoughts. That's basically what they do. Two lines, they fit together, and they can either tell the same thing, maybe with a slight development, some deepening of the idea, or they are contrasting. They belong together, but they contrast, and therefore they create a new picture. An example of contrast is in Psalm 1 verse 6, for example. He said, see there, the Lord watches over the way of the righteous, positive, but contrast, but the way of the wicked leads to destruction. Two lines fitting together, one is positive, one is negative. And the repetition then of such lines that go together, that go parallel, it forces us to slow down and to think a bit more over the feeling and the meaning of it all. It's basically looking at the same idea from two different angles. As if you're looking at a diamond and you're turning it around from one side, from a different side. So you see the same thing, but tiny bit differently. Again, just hearing a few of these things that Hebrew poetry uses. How can we use it to understand and read these poetry bits better? Now, the first thing is, if one of the lines is unclear, use the second line to understand it better. It might help to clarify the meaning. And the other lesson is that we shouldn't press the differences too much. If they are basically saying the same thing, so don't try and dig into the tiny nuance difference between two lines. Generally, that's not the point, but together they want to give us an emotion or a feeling. A very clear example of this is in Psalm 19. If you turn over a few pages, Psalm 19, verse 7 and following, where it speaks of the law of the Lord and how good it is. It uses all these different words for the law of God. Law, statutes, precepts, commands, and so on. The point is not, what's the tiny bit of difference between all these lines, between all these verses. And in the second bit of the verses, refreshing the soul, making wise the simple, giving joy to the heart, and so on. Don't sort of try and puzzle out the difference. No, what's the overall picture? Basically, they're all saying the same thing, and they're showing us the beauty and the goodness of the law of God. Basically, they say in a poetry form what Paul says in Romans 7, in ordinary language. The commandment is holy and righteous and good. Full stop. But Psalm 19 does it in poetry language, trying to evoke with us, with all these different comparisons, to even feel it and experience it. Now, two more brief applications, and then I want to close with something more about Psalm 2. First, the way God uses so much poetry in the Bible, I think it shows us that the purpose of the Bible is not just to give us information. The purpose is to transform us, to make us feel things, experience things, relate to things, not just in an intellectual way, but with our whole life. To be changed by it, basically. Otherwise, God would have given us a tiny book of systematic theology and just normal language. No, we get so much poetry to involve our whole lives. Our chief end is to glorify God and enjoy Him forever. And the second lesson, sort of overall, is that we need to read these poetry bits slowly. So often we just skim over it, right? But if you skim over a chapter like this, you will miss all the picture language, and you're not pausing down, slowing down to let it sink in and what it means. Our emotions don't get involved. And that's really a challenge to me, I guess. It's so often easy to open the Bible and, just like a story, you skim read a chapter and you close it again. But our emotions don't have time sort of to catch up on it. And so the power of the poetry is lost. Now, finally, Psalm 2. Go back to it then. I thought, shall I stop here or not? I think, no, that will be a pity. Then we've read Psalm 2 and I've given you examples, but you still don't have a clue, maybe, if it's the first time you read it. What's this song all about? So let me briefly just say, okay, what's actually this song all about? And some of the things we've seen will come together. Psalm 2 is full of these parallel lines. It's structured in a detailed way. It's full of picture language. And you can see, as our Bibles do it, it's 4 sections. 4 sections that tell a story. And the New Testament tells us that this psalm was written by David. And together with Psalm 1, then, as I said, it forms the introduction to the book of Psalms. It's bracketed by that word blessed. And it gives us the main themes that are unpacked in the rest of this book. The first section, verse 1 to 3, describes how earthly rulers are rebelling against God. But note the tone and how it starts. It says, why do the nations conspire? That question is a rhetorical question. Again, a figure of speech. Someone said it's not expecting an answer here. No, it is expressing astonishment. The question is not a cry of desperation, but it is saying, I'm confident God is on the throne, so why are these nations rising up? Why would you rebel against God? How foolish is that? And we come to the second section, and it shows us clearly that God is sovereign over all those rebelling kings. And God is going to put his king on the throne. It's the message we've been seeing in the book of Daniel, that only God's kingdom lasts forever, and that he is sovereign over all the nations. And the laughing there of God is picking up on our human emotions, as it were, to show just how foolish that is. In the third section then, verse 7 to 9, zooms in on that king. It is presented as a message from God. It said, this is the Lord's decree, and spoken so that the king, to that king, he said to me, verse 7, this king is the Son. It is Jesus. Hebrews and other parts of the New Testament pick it up, that this psalm is in the end about Jesus. Jesus will be that king on David's throne forever. He will rule over all the nations. They are his inheritance to the ends of the earth, and he will judge over them. And that picture of verse 9 shows how he in the end will win and will defeat all those rebels who stand up against his rule. And now verse 7 might be a bit tricky, because it says, if Jesus is saying this, how does that work? You are my son, today I have become your father. Or in verse 8, I will make the nations your inheritance. So doesn't Jesus already have that? And isn't he already the son? How is this going to work? Well, think of this song not as something about describing the birth of Jesus, but about his coronation. How he, as a human being in this world, becomes the king. And how he, after fulfilling everything God has asked of him, how he, by his death and resurrection, becomes that king of the whole world. And then he can say to his disciples at the end of Matthew's Gospel, right, in the Great Commission, all authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. Now he can say that as the risen human king, the ruler. And Psalm 2 therefore poetically speaks of God's promise to David, of this Messiah, of the promised Saviour King, who will reign over the entire world. And no human being, no king will even in the end be able to stand up against him. And then we come to the final section, in section 4, verse 10 to 12. And it tells those kings, and actually all of us, how to respond to these great truths. Be wise, be warned, serve the Lord with fear, and celebrate his rule with trembling. That's what we saw this morning, what Daniel did, serving the Lord, serving God. But directly then here in verse 12, we see how that rule of God is given through that Son, through the King that he has promised. Verse 12, kiss the Son, or he will be angry, and your way will lead to your destruction. And kissing the Son here is a picture of submission. Now you've seen it in a film about some medieval period with knights and kings and so on, how they kiss on the head or on the cheeks or maybe on the hand. It's a sign of submitting. Yes, you are my king. It's the opposite of rebellion that we saw earlier in the song. And then at the end we see that good news. Because when we do indeed kiss the Son, when we accept Jesus as Lord and King of our lives, we will be blessed. That word blessed, it means happy, or that you are congratulated, that it will be good with you. Blessed are all who take refuge in him. So have you done that?